impetus behind How Corrupt is Britain? Why did you decide to put it together at this time?
Well, mainly there was a seemingly endless number of cases in the media about institutional corruption, corruption in the police, in the finance sector, and a range of corporations, and also in politics. That seemed to be kind of gathering momentum a couple of years ago, and it seemed to be important to try and explain this. And also, there's a complacency in the British establishment about the nature of British democracy. And that complacency, it's almost like a kind of self-promoting myth. The British establishment is fair, it's democratic, that the institutions in Britain are foundation stones of this heritage in which corruption is something that happens on the other side of the world in less developed or more primitive societies. And clearly that's not the case. We have evidence that corruption is rife in some of our most venerated and most respected institutions. So it's fundamentally important to try and explain that, and also to try and almost shake people out of their complacency. Britain is fundamentally corrupt. Look, the starting point is that we have to understand corruption at an institutional level, right? So that corruption, as normally defined, focuses on the individual. It focuses on individual gain, normally bribery. Now, that's not to say there is no bribery in Britain, but it doesn't seem to be the key problem. Corruption is organised at an institutional level for the benefit of institutions. So the introduction to the book draws three main conclusions. The first one being that corruption is always related to the way in which our dominant notion of the public interest is constructed. So, you know, if we see private profiteering at the level that we see in the City of London as something that is in the public interest, and clearly some people in government do, then we have a problem, right? We have a problem with corruption. So we have to rethink the public interest. That's the first point. Secondly, opportunities for corruption are always related to the structure of regulation. So when there is a politics of impunity that the book describes in so many of those cases, then of course we're likely to see enhanced opportunities for corruption. And thirdly, levels of corruption are quite simply related to the way that power is concentrated in a given social system. And since the 1980s, power has been concentrated in centrally organised government institutions, including the police and the security services. Power has been concentrated in the finance sector particularly, and the corporate sector generally. And power has been concentrated in politics. So unless we open up those institutions and make them more vulnerable to public demands, unless we empower communities and the public to challenge power, then we will still have a problem of corruption. We have to say that this institutional corruption also undermines the ability of the state to guarantee our protection from corruption. So the system of checks and balances and the autonomy, for example, of regulatory agencies or those who are supposed to safeguard us have also been undermined. But the problem is major. I mean, we really don't have a social structure which is geared up to dealing with corruption. You know, if you look at the most serious cases of corruption that are dealt with by the Serious Fraud Office, I mean, the Serious Fraud Office only has the resources to prosecute 10 people a year. The IPCC is under fire, of course, in terms of its inability to deal with police corruption. And probably, according to the IPCC's own data, much less than 1 in 400 cases of reported corruption are even investigated. But the main message of the book really is that corruption is not, as we normally think, an effect of power. It's not just a kind of a side effect or something that happens because power is concentrated. Corruption reproduces power. So corruption is a means by which institutions maintain and concentrate power, and I think it's not an easy point to deal with, but we have to deal with it if we're going to sort out the problem of corruption. Well, the book's divided into 4 parts. The first part looks at general issues, which try and explore the kind of definitional reasons for this complacency about corruption in Britain. Tries to confront and deconstruct some of the problems in the definition of corruption, and it tries to put Britain in the context, or British corruption in the context of what's been happening in global capitalism in the past 2 or 3 decades. Part 2 looks at policing with a focus on the Hillsborough case and the manipulation of evidence in the Hillsborough case. There's also a chapter on the manipulation of evidence in the aftermath of the shooting of Mark Duggan. Part 3 focuses on corruption in government and politics, and there are chapters on the recent expose about the Hooded Men torture case, and that was a cover-up around a torture case in Northern Ireland, which implicated members of the British government to the highest level. There's a chapter on the Jimmy Savile case. There's a chapter on the relationship between government and profiteering companies. So the focus there is on government and politics. Part 4 looks at the finance and corporate sector. There's a chapter on tax avoidance and tax evasion. There's a chapter on the routine theft from consumers by high street banks and high street finance companies. And there's a chapter on the obscene widening gap between high and low pay, and it describes what's going on as a prime case of corruption in the British corporate sector.